In the dim light of an early spring dawn in 1775, the American colonies stood at the edge of a knife. For years, arguments, protests, and defiant words had echoed from one town to another, growing louder with every new British law and every act of colonial resistance. But now, on the horizon, something darker was rising, something far more dangerous than angry speeches or spilled tea. The smell in the air had changed. It smelled of gunpowder, fear, and the beginning of a conflict no one could turn away from. War, once unthinkable, was crawling closer with each passing hour. Whispers traveled faster than horses could gallop. British troops were moving. More ships had been sighted in the harbor. Redcoats marched through the streets with stone-cold expressions, their boots thudding in perfect rhythm. People watched from behind shutters, wondering quietly to themselves, is this the moment everything finally breaks? In Boston, the tension felt alive, like a creature lurking between homes and taverns. The British had fortified the city, surrounding it with troops, cannons, and warships that bobbed menacingly in the harbor. To the colonists outside the city, Boston was a prison holding thousands of their own people. To the British, it was a stronghold, one they believed the colonists were foolish to challenge. But the colonists had changed. No longer were they scattered farmers and merchants arguing about taxes. They had tasted defiance, and it had awakened something powerful. From every colony, men with muskets, worn boots, and sharpened determination flowed toward the outskirts of Boston. They formed crude camps, armed themselves with whatever they could find, and waited under cold skies for orders from leaders who had never commanded an army before. Still, no official war had been declared, not yet. Inside Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress gathered men who knew that the decisions they made would shape the destiny of millions. Some still hoped peace could be saved. Others believed only force would make Britain listen. But all understood one thing. The colonies stood at a point of no return. And then it happened. Gunfire erupted at Lexington and Concord. Smoke filled the countryside. Farmers became soldiers. British troops marched through fields they had once believed were harmless and faced a resistance fiercer than they expected. The war had already begun before anyone could formally name it. By the time news of Lexington and Concord reached Congress, the mood shifted sharply. No more arguments, no more waiting. A decision had to be made not in whispers, but boldly before the world. George Washington, tall and stern, wearing his simple military uniform, rose from his seat. He did not beg for a command. He did not boast. He simply declared that the colonies needed a unified army, an army strong enough to challenge the empire that ruled half the globe. And Congress, sensing the urgency in every heartbeat of the room, agreed. In that moment, on a warm June day, the Continental Army was born, and Washington became its commander. But Washington had no army waiting for him. Only thousands of untrained men camped around Boston, fueled by courage but lacking discipline, ammunition, and strategy. And he knew that in Boston, the British were preparing something too. Across the harbor, British generals watched the swelling colonial forces with cold calculation. They believed the rebellion would collapse as soon as the colonists felt the true weight of British firepower. So when colonial militias quietly moved onto Breed's Hill and built overnight fortifications, the British decided to crush them fast and brutally before the rebellion could spread further. The day of battle dawned hot and bright. British ships opened fire, sending roaring blasts across the water, shaking the ground beneath colonial feet. Redcoats lined up in perfect formation, their bright coats gleaming like spilled blood under the sun. As they marched toward the hill, the colonists remained eerily still. They had one order: hold your fire until you see the whites of their eyes. The British climbed, step by step, closer and closer, expecting the colonists to panic, to break, to flee. But they didn't. And when the British were close enough that their eyes were clear and human rather than distant shapes of war, the hill exploded with musket fire. The first wave of redcoats fell like a single body. Then a second wave marched, steady and stubborn, only to be torn apart once more. Smoke swallowed the battlefield. Screams rose above the gunfire. The colonists fought as if every shot was the last they might ever take. But slowly, inevitably, their ammunition began to run out. Men searched frantically for powder, for bullets, for anything that might keep them alive. The British launched a third assault, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades. This time, the hill could not hold. With empty muskets and exhausted arms, the colonists were forced to retreat. But the British victory was hollow. Their casualties were horrifying. Boston shook that night, not with the sounds of celebration, but with the realization that the colonists were far more dangerous than anyone had believed. The Battle of Bunker Hill spread fear and respect in equal measure. It told the British that the rebellion was no mere riot. And it told the colonists that they could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest army in the world. Yet even with blood spilled and cities besieged, there was still a small, fragile thread of hope. Congress, desperate to avoid a full war if peace was still possible, sent one last message to King George III. It was gentle, pleading, almost sorrowful. The Olive Branch Petition. A final attempt to mend the relationship before it shattered forever. But the king never saw desperation in their words, only rebellion, only defiance. He rejected the petition without hesitation. And with that single refusal, the last bridge between Britain and the colonies burned to ash. When Washington finally reached the camps around Boston, he found himself standing among men who looked like ordinary farmers but carried the hearts of soldiers. Around them, the siege tightened. Food ran low. Supplies were scarce. Disease crept through tents like an invisible enemy. But their morale against all odds remained unbroken. Every night, fires glowed across the hills surrounding Boston like stars fallen to the earth. Washington walked among his men, watching them clean their muskets, whispering prayers, writing letters to families they might never see again. He felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily upon him, heavier than any armor. The fate of the colonies of a new kind of freedom rested on the shoulders of a man who had never led more than a few hundred troops before this moment. The British watched from within Boston, surrounded, frustrated, and increasingly desperate to break the siege. Every day they waited for reinforcements, convinced that the rebellion was only temporary. But Washington had already begun shaping the chaos into order. Drills at dawn. Fortifications strengthened. Ammunition rationed. And slowly, with each passing week, the colony's vast, fragile hope hardened into something stronger. The world held its breath. No peace, no turning back. The war had begun. And though no one knew how long it would last or what it would cost, one truth echoed across every colony, whispered by farmers, soldiers, mothers, and children alike. Everything has changed, forever.